used to be a scuba instructor in Bali, Indonesia. Groups could book me for a casual lesson or for like a week's worth of diving where they could earn a provisional diving license. So this one group books me. They're a mixed group in their early 20s, couples and friends. Good people, silver spoons galore, but I'm not one to judge. Our first activity was underwater walking. Now, I had never tried underwater walking since it was relatively new at the time, but I'm keen to try it. So we pile into a little boat and take a short trip out towards the mothership. Now, this is just a naval term for a larger boat that smaller ones like ours can work from, but we go one step further to justify this, having spray-painted one of those huge gray alien heads onto the hull. It looked awesome, and naturally the kids loved it. Underwater walking itself was similar to the time I did snuba. Scuba plus snorkeling equals snuba. In the Caribbean, in that the oxygen tanks float up on the surface of the water instead of being on the diver's back. The other major difference to regular diving is that instead of having a scuba mask to breathe out of, we had these big old sci-fi looking helmets on. I mean, they look like they were props from that old Lost in Space show that used to be on TV. I went first, and the procedure was pretty simple. I hung onto the ladder with the majority of my body in the water. They placed a small foam rubber ring on my head to cushion the helmet, and then they finally put the helmet on. The second that it was on my body, it felt like its weight was forcing me to the bottom of the ocean. It was kind of scary because I went down pretty fast, which caused the pressure to build up quickly. I made sure to swallow and yawn a bunch to negate the effects of the pressure, and I was fine. Also, I could never really get a deep breath of air because as I breathed in, the helmet began to make a vacuum and I would have to stop to let it fill in with more air. Then 2 members of the mixed group of teens followed suit before a scuba diving man came down to be our guide. He handed all of us a piece of bread in a plastic bag which drew all of the fish to us. That was a lot of fun watching otherwise timid fish practically swarming us. There were metal guiding handrails in the ocean floor which I followed. The 2 kids followed behind me. It was very difficult to walk because the current was surprisingly strong and the helmets were quite heavy. We found it all incredibly enjoyable though. I had been diving for years and even to me it was a novelty. As I breathed, there was a constant loud whirring sound as the water put pressure on the oxygen tube. It was kind of annoying, but it meant that I was getting air, which was obviously good. That's why it was so scary when the sound suddenly stopped. I was confused, but it quickly came back on after about 2 or 3 seconds and I could breathe again. It happened one more time and again it came back on very quickly. I rationalized it by assuming that my tank had run empty and they were switching it to a different one. No big deal. I didn't understand how they would run out so quickly, but I didn't think too hard about it. It soon came back on and I could breathe, so no big deal. After about 10 minutes or so, I'm guessing, I have no idea how long we were down there, the guide points at me and indicates that he wants me to climb over the railing. I was very confused, but I did it after he made it very clear that that was what he wanted. It was kind of hard to see out any peripherals out of the mass, so it was easy to get lost. I looked back behind me to make sure that the teenagers saw where I went and didn't get lost. We made eye contact, so I assumed we were all good and then turned back around to follow the guide. He had me walking in a very small path between 2 corals, so I went very slowly to make sure that I didn't cut my legs up on them. It was hard due to the strong underwater current, my unwieldy helmet, and an occasional tug by the air tube as I pulled it taut. As I reached the guide, my air stopped again. I figured it was no big deal, like the previous 2 times, and continued on. I followed him for a bit, but it still didn't come on. 5 seconds without oxygen, then 10. I started to get confused. Was this some kind of joke? If so, it wasn't funny at all. 15 seconds. I thought to myself, don't panic. They always tell you not to panic. But I panicked. I started taking quicker and quicker breaths, but I forced myself to stop that. Thanks to previous training, I knew that that was the worst thing I could do. I spun around to the guide and started pounding my fist on my chest. That was the sign for I can't breathe. He seemed to notice and started walking away. I could only hope that he was taking me to the boat. I thought maybe I should just try and shrug off the helmet and swim to the surface. I didn't know if I had enough air to make it. I didn't know if the boat was above me. I didn't want to hit my head. I didn't know if I could actually shrug it off, and I didn't want to get the bends, so I figured it wouldn't be a good idea. 30 seconds. I started to notice that I was getting less and less oxygen with each breath. Water was starting to seep into my helmet. I had to look up to breathe with the little air that I had. I grabbed hold of the guide's arms so that I wouldn't lose him, and also so that he would understand the gravity of the situation. I gave him quite the death grip. 40 seconds without oxygen, my lungs burned for air. I saw the ladder of the boat. I knew that all I had to do was make it there and I would be okay. I must have gotten some sort of adrenaline rush with the renewed hope because I almost forgot about my lack of air. I fumbled for the ladder for a few seconds. It was hard to tell distances through the helmet because it had a bit of a magnifying aspect to it, before I grabbed it and started pulling myself up. As I broke the surface, air came rushing back into my helmet and I took a nice deep breath. Breathing had never felt better. It was definitely the scariest experience of my life, and I categorically would not recommend underwater walking to anyone. Being that I live on the coast of Mississippi, I have been on and around the water my entire life. I have countless stories of crazy experiences and bizarre happenings while being on the water. Most involve dealing with bad weather, such as lightning storms, water spouts, or rough seas. Those can be awesomely frightening, but the craziest things that I've seen have happened while working on fishing charter boats. But the one job that always sticks with me, and the one I would consider the biggest eye-opener, occurred back in 2010 when the Deepwater Horizon oil rig blew and began spewing oil into the Gulf of Mexico. BP, after realizing to a certain extent how vast the spill was, began a program that allowed owners of boats to register and participate in the cleanup efforts along the coastline. Those that were lucky enough to be accepted into the program sometimes took advantage of an awesome opportunity to do something good for the environment and made some serious money from it while, at the same time, preventing others from getting into the program who would have actually helped. That's somewhat mentioned later, but overall is a story for another discussion. So being that the water that I had basically grown up on was being destroyed, I couldn't just sit back and not do anything. I went and got hazmat certified. Then through certain contacts, I first started working on a 127-foot charter boat that would normally go out to the Chandeleur Islands located off the coast of Louisiana for several days and nights and drop skiffs in the water where clients were guided around the islands to fish. Also, I would suggest if anyone has the opportunity to go out to these islands, please do. It's absolutely incredible there and the fishing is always superb. Anyway, back to the story. I was working on this boat for about 2 weeks before I was transferred to an offshore division that consisted of about a dozen boats. These boats were strictly personal fishing and commercial charter boats, with the largest being 57 feet and an average price of around $100,000. A couple of the other boats had to be worth well over $1 million conservatively. Our job was to leave at the crack of dawn and go out looking for oil or any marine life that may have been impacted by the spill. If we found crude oil, slicks, or anything else out of place or not normal, we'd log it, take pictures, and report it. For about a month, all we ever found were slicks. But one day, we went out about 100 miles or so, and I'll never forget the sights or smells that day. The crude oil, which we called mud because that is exactly what it looked like, was everywhere and ridiculously thick. On average 6 inches and in some places up to 1 foot. It was like super thick putty and to be honest is actually really hard to describe. To put this into perspective though, if you've ever been mud riding or seen a truck get stuck in the mud, that's exactly what it was like to these boats, but out on the water and a lot worse. Over time, it destroyed the boat's hulls and caused significant damage to pretty much whatever it touched. We were the first group to find the crude and report it coming in that close to the shore. Also during this time, we found a life jacket belonging to one of the poor guys who actually worked on the oil rig when it blew. Words honestly can't describe what that was like. It was a haunting moment to say the least. So, we eventually get back to shore, and that's when things started to change. The operation had now shifted to, how are we going to clean this up? And what are we going to do with it? It wasn't until this point when we all realized how serious this was, not only for the coastline but for the environment as a whole. The next morning at the dock, we noticed that pallets of skimmers and absorbent materials had been dropped off. We were to use the skimmers to round up as much crude as we could, tie off the skimmers into a circle, and place the boom together with the crude inside. That would then be brought to the decontamination stations by another division who was assigned that job. A little reminder, our job originally was to just spot, find, take pictures, and report back, not necessarily handle the oil if at all possible. But it got to the point where instead of myself being the only one who could handle the crude on my boat, everyone else working the boats eventually ended up in protective suits handling this toxic, sludgy substance in 100+ degree temperatures for 12 hours a day. A little side note, each boat had to have at least one hazmat certified person on board at all times who was supposed to be the only person handling the crude. Also, only 4 people were allowed to work on each boat in our division. We also ended up getting stranded twice by the shrimp boats, who decided to call it a day, leaving us with no way to move the crude while also not allowing us to leave because we couldn't just leave the rounded up crude unattended. It was absolutely miserable. Nobody could have ever imagined what we were getting into. BP themselves had no idea what they were getting into, and their claims of being prepared were completely overshadowed by the fact that they truly did not know how to run and contain an operation of this magnitude day in and day out. This became a day-to-day challenge up until the point when my shady boss got caught being greedy, charging BP for every miscellaneous thing he bought, which caused all of his boats to be shut down. During this time, both the employer and employees were making some serious money. What ruined it were the greedy jerks who just couldn't get enough. This, in turn, caused less boats that were actually doing it for the right reasons from being able to make a change out on the water. In total, we worked a little over 3 months. Going out every day and seeing schools of dead fish, dead sea turtles, was disheartening to say the least. Although it was one of the most awful experiences of my life, I do feel like we made a difference out there, even if it was just a little. On one of our last trips, we were about 20 or so miles out past the barrier islands when we could see from a distance what looked like the water boiling and had a red, orange, and yellow color to it. When we got close, we realized it was a school of thousands of redfish and Jack Crevelli that stretched as far as we could see and was about 100 or so yards wide. Being in the middle of that, surrounded by these fish, just cannot be described with words. It was incredible, and that was the one moment that gave us hope that what we were doing was not a waste, and that we were in fact doing something worthwhile. Still to this day, it is the most incredible thing I'd ever seen on the water aside from the oil spill itself. Lastly, just to throw this out there are still tons of oil out in the Gulf regardless of what people say. It's just buried and on the seafloor due to the so-called dispersants that BP claimed would break the oil up. It still can be found on the island's beaches and marshes. The marine life is just now getting back to normal again in the past 2 years, and it's only going to get better as long as some nonsense like this doesn't happen again. May have been an incredibly rare occurrence, but it illustrates just how little we know about what lurks beneath the waves. How we well and truly roll the dice when venturing into unknown waters. How the planet's oceans are just as brutal and nightmarish as the densest jungles or driest deserts. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r Let's Read Official. and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video.